Good morning and welcome. This is our 11th session of Hilchot Shabbat. We are reading chapter 253 in Shulchan Aruch or Haim, speaking about placing food on a stove before Shabbat. The Shulchan Aruch speaks about kira, tanur, and vekupah. Those are different types of ovens that are not used today. When we take it to today's reality, we use a hot plate, either electric or stovetop, electric or gas, with a blech tin sheet on top. People use crock pots, or Shabbat, or an oven that has a Shabbat mode or not. So with all these different modes of heating food for Shabbat, the simple rule is this: as long as you made a special sign, a special reminder, to remind yourself that today is Shabbat and you're not going to touch that appliance or whatever mode of heating that you're using, then there is no problem. One could cover the knobs of the gas stove or the electric stove, cover it with aluminum foil, make a certain mark that will remind you that today is Shabbat, I'm not going to touch it. If once that is done, it's called Gufa Huktuma, it's called the covered fire, and with that you could leave anything on it before Shabbat, whether it's fully, partially, or not at all cooked. And even if you put a sign, don't touch Shabbat mode, that also helps. All you need to know is a reminder that this is not to be touched on Shabbat. And we mentioned previously that there are two concepts here. One is actual cooking, the other one is mihzekim bashel, the perception of cooking. That if one thinks that he is cooking on Shabbat, even though he's not, that might lead him to do something which is forbidden on Shabbat. So as long as you make a clear sign and reminder to yourself that you are on Shabbat mode and you're not going to cook, that would not be a problem, and anything can be left on the hot plate. There is a concept that is mentioned in the Mishnah of Hatmana, to which the next chapter in Shulchan Aruch 255 to 56 are dedicated, but we don't do this today. The Hatmana of the time of the Mishnah is something completely different. Hatmana means covering. So some poskim extended the concept of covering to putting blankets on top of the pots, something that we used to do when we were kids because the hot plates were not that hot. I don't see it done that often anymore. But what the Mishnah speaks about is wrapping a pot completely in a wool blanket or different materials that would not use today, like feathers, sand, salt, and even fertilizer, to keep it warm, because they didn't have means of keeping the food warm for Shabbat. In all these cases, there were certain categories where you're allowed to do it and where you're not allowed to do it. But they all refer to complete enclosure of the pot on Shabbat. And some people carried it into today's reality, where they say if you pick up the lid, put it back, it's called covering or wrapping, and if you put a blanket on top, it's called wrapping. All these things are not really rooted in the Mishnah, and they should not be a problem. Of course, you could avoid them if you want, but they shouldn't. There shouldn't be a problem in doing so. When reheating food on Shabbat, when you have a hot plate covered or marked, as I said, with the knobs removed or with aluminum foil, then you could reheat anything that was already cooked on Shabbat, before Shabbat. Anything could be reheated on Shabbat, even if it's completely cold, for a very simple reason, and that is en bishul har bishul. There's no cooking after cooking, meaning once a certain element is cooked, that's it. You cannot reverse it and bring it back to its previous state. Because the prohibition of cooking on Shabbat, as it is explained in the Gemara and later poskim, is changing the physical state of an object, usually food. There are also things that apply to metal and other non-food items, but usually we talk about food. So once you change the status of food from non-baked to baked or cooked, you cannot scale it back. For example, bread when we talk about baking bread, it's turning it from dough to bread. Once the bread is baked, you cannot bake it again. So even if you take a slice of bread and put it on the hot plate until it's toasted, then you didn't bake it because it was already baked. You just added you extended the level of crispiness or whatever it is that this slice of bread has, but it's not called cooking. Same thing with roasted coffee or tea or any food that was cooked before Shabbat. When you put it on the hot plate on Shabbat and it reheats, there is no problem. Some are more strict based on the Shulchan Aruch. There's room to be lenient because of the logical rule that I mentioned, that there's no bishul or har bishul, and also relying on the ruling of the Rama Rabbi Moshe Isalis at the end of chapter 253 in Shulchan Aruch, at the end of 253.5. The type of food that causes most problems to observant Jews is food with sauce or liquids, because we find in the Shulchan Aruch that one cannot reheat liquids on Shabbat. But the same rule applies here as well. Once something is cooked, you cannot recook it. So it doesn't matter if it's sauce or soup. Soup is cooked, that's it. You can't recook it. So Rabbi Ovadia Yosef offers two ways to bypass the perception of cooking on Shabbat when you put liquids. He says you could reheat even soup, and the way you do it, says you put it on the hot plate and you remove it before it starts bubbling, or you ask a non-Jew to place it there. Both those things are sort of legal fiction, but they're legal fiction just to remind us not to cook, not to do something that would lead us to cooking on Shabbat. But even if one puts it directly there, there is no problem. So here there is an interesting division of between the poskim, between the Sephardim, Ashkenazim, and Yemenites. The Sephardim find Shulchan Aruch. Many of them rule that you cannot put something back on the hot plate unless it's still hot. The Ashkenazim say that as long as it has some warmth in it, you could still put it back. Maimonides and in his footsteps, the Yemenite community say that even if it's completely cold, you could put it back. And it's very probable that the Rema, whom the Ashkenazim follow, who says that you could put it back even if it has a little warmth, actually holds like Maimonides, who says that even if it's completely cold, you could put it back. Just that he wanted to make some boundary to remind people, as we mentioned before. But Lema'aseh, in practice, we could all rely on Maimonides, return anything to be reheated on Shabbat, even soup, and the Yemenite practice is even water. So they would, in many Yemenite households, they would heat water before Shabbat in a big pot, and then on Shabbat put it in a smaller vessel, in a smaller kettle on the hot plate. And here comes into the picture an interesting exchange of halachic question and answer between a sort of modern Yemenite rabbi in Israel and one of the rabbis of the previous generation. I think it was the Mahari Salah or Mahari Chesal. I don't have the teshuvah under my hand right now, but the gist of the question was this: the younger rabbi who grew up in Ashkenazi yeshivot in Israel wrote to the older rabbi saying, "We have a problem with our Yemenite brethren, with our people in our community who reheat water on Shabbat, and this is not acceptable, and people think that they are transgressing Shabbat." The older rabbi answered, he says, "Hanach lehem im mekilim hem behimu mayim mahmirim hem be'onek Shabbat." He says, you think that they are lenient regarding the rules of reheating water on Shabbat, but actually they're strict. They're very strict with the halachot of respecting the Shabbat. They want to have hot water on Shabbat for tea or coffee, and so they could follow their practice. And in the same manner, we could all follow that practice, not to worry on Shabbat if you have to reheat food once it's cooked, it's not a problem. We don't have the problem with water. Most people have Shabbat urns or thermoses. We have different ways to keep water hot. But what is most important is to avoid strife and fights around this thing. Too often, I've heard from families where one family member, one spouse wanted to reheat something. The other one says, no, it's not. You can't do it because it has sauce and this, or this is not my practice. And they were fighting over this, and they had to serve cold food to the guests. Make sure that you know the full spectrum of halakha and know that once in this case, once something is cooked or baked or roasted or whatever it is, and you have a hot plate or stove or anything that is covered and marked as on Shabbat mode before Shabbat. Once you have that, you could reheat on Shabbat anything. And most importantly, as I said, make sure there's peace and harmony in the household and enjoy the oneg of Shabbat. Have a great day.